Welcome to Section 1 of ITIL 4 Specialist Drive Stakeholder Value Certification Training Program from One World Training. In this module, we're going to understand the concept of customer journeys. In particularly, the concept of the customer journey and the ways of designing and improving customer journey. And also regarding touch points and service interactions, the benefits of understanding customer journeys and the look of a generic ITIL customer journey. How you deliver a service is as important as what you deliver. For example, how convenient it may be for the user to order something before they receive it and start using it. Understanding every touch point and interaction is not enough. You must take the journey yourself as a provider and understand the end-to-end experience. We will come to the terms touchpoint and interaction on the subsequent slide shortly. When you understand the customer journey, you can maximize stakeholder value through co-creation and focus on experience, not just on outcomes. Touchpoints. Any event where a service consumer or potential service consumer has an encounter with the service provider and or its products and resources. Example of a touchpoint could be a consumer seeing an ad in the media about the provider. There is no interaction here, but it is just a touch point. And this touch point will create an impression on the consumer. Another example of a touch point could be a user receiving a message about the status of a request, where there is no interaction, but it is still a touch point. In general, most touch points will include service interactions, but some may not. A service interaction is a value co-creating reciprocal action between a service provider and a service consumer. For example, a user chatting with a bot or speaking to customer care about a request which they have made earlier. In this case, there is interaction. So it is a touch point, but also an interaction at the same time. Customer journey is the combination of these, a complete end-to-end experience that service customers have with one or more service providers and their products through touch points and service interactions. For example, the experience received when a new service is released for a customer, or when a user reports an issue and obtains a resolution to their issue. That's a complete journey. Let us understand why the customer journey really matters, both for the consumer as well as the service provider. From three perspectives. The first perspective is about facilitating outcomes and experiences. For the consumer, it is about gaining optimal service value and experience, wherein the provider understands their needs and desires and not just what the customer states. For the provider, it is about identifying and supporting specific customer behaviors and outcomes, and to optimize or improve products, services, and journeys. An example of a customer behavior can be their sense of urgency, or are they asking for advice, or are they very specific about any of their issues? Optimizing risk and compliance also occurs. For the consumer, it is about ensuring their risks are identified and addressed. For the provider, it is about focusing on customer satisfaction and areas with the highest payouts for the cost. An example of a consumer risk could be whether a consumer could return a product, or what do they do if it does not work properly. Optimizing resources and minimizing cost. For both the provider and the consumer, it is about working together to commit and optimize resources used during the product or service lifecycle. Examples of optimization could be using multi-skilled people, or combining teams, or integrating systems. For the provider, in addition, it is important to be fair and transparent with the costs. Customer journeys are connected with value streams. A customer journey relies on at least one value stream from all involved parties. For example, when a customer has an issue and they call up the service desk, a certain value stream will be triggered to respond to the customer, and the customer experiences a journey. On the other hand, when a customer makes a request for upgradation of a service, It may call on another value stream regarding the upgradation of the service, and they may have a different customer journey for that. The picture here shows us two customer journeys. Customer 1 from consumer A relies on the value stream 4 as well as value stream 3, whereas customer 2 from consumer B organization relies on value stream 1, 2, 3 as well as 4. Some of the value streams are dependent on other value streams, and these value streams are provided by two service providers. A single value stream usually supports multiple journeys. For example, a new service release is a single value stream. However, it can support two journeys of the customer. Initially, the requirements gathering journey, and afterwards, the acceptance testing journey. Both are separate journeys, but still part of the same value stream for the new service release. The journey does not follow a fixed path always, but various touch points based on the situation. As an example, when a customer finds everything smoothly going, it is one path. But during that journey, if something goes wrong, then the path deviates. Therefore, journeys do not follow a fixed path always. It depends on the progress from one touch point and service interaction to another touch point or interaction until the end of the journey. Journeys, therefore, are important sources of customer experience and user experience, and are also influenced by the digital environment and interactions with the service provider. CX, customer experience, the sum of the functional and emotional interactions with the service and service provider as perceived by a customer. Remember that a customer is the one who defines the requirements of the service and is responsible for the outcomes of the service, whereas a user is somebody who uses a service. Both of them are roles from the consumer organization. Another role from the consumer organization is the sponsor, who is responsible for the funding to consume the service. User experience is very similar to customer experience, however, it's from the user's perception. So as we note here, the journey may follow a simple fixed path or a complex emerging path, but still they should be clearly understood and managed. Because customers perceive the end-to-end experience, therefore individual touch points must provide a good experience, and the overall journey must meet the consumer's expectations. Therefore, the journey is a specific experience in a service consumer life cycle. For example, a consumer may be researching a service, and that could be the initial part of their journey. But afterwards, they may request for the service or explore the service further, and then once they receive the service, they will start using it. So the journey continues. And as part of a single journey, they may involve several service providers rather than just a single service provider. Generally, end-to-end journey scores are low for the providers, though the touch point scores are high. This happens generally because the teams lose sight of the consumer needs and desires, particularly in the multi-channel environments, which lack consistency even though each channel might have done their work very well. An example of a channel could be your user trying to reach the service desk through a phone line and afterwards asking for status through a website. And when these channels are not integrated, then it can become a difficult journey for the user. On the other hand, when these channels are integrated, as in the case of omni-channels or integrated channels, then the journey is much smoother. Therefore, not only the touch points and service interactions should be understood and improved, but also the entire customer journey and service experience should be mapped to visualize consumer experience, because it teaches organizations about their stakeholders. When mapping the journey, it is important to consider stakeholders, the journey timeframes, the various channels of interaction and touch points, and the actions which occur before, during, and after the experience. Let us pause here for reflecting on the learnings and to make notes of some of the learnings. Let us continue our understanding of the customer journey and the service interaction. On this slide, we have the concept of the band of visibility. The band of visibility is not included in the exam syllabus. However, it is useful to understand it. Firstly, here are the 7 steps of the customer journey, beginning with the step explore, followed by engage, offer, agree, onboard, co-create, and realize. We see the interaction between the customer and the service provider. This is the service interaction curve. Whereas we see the dotted lines on this side as well as the customer side, this is the line of visibility, meaning the service provider is not able to see the customer beyond this line. And similarly, the customer is not able to see the service provider beyond this line. Therefore, between them, they create a band of visibility. This band of visibility are the activities and resources within a service relationship that are visible to both the provider and the customer. The service experience is therefore formed within this band, meaning the touch points, interactions, the visible products and environments are within this band of visibility. However, the invisible parts influence the visible parts. The width of this band depends on the nature of the service, the stakeholder relationships, and the journey's degree of completeness. For example, in a partnership, the band would be wider because there is more transparency between the provider and the customer. Whereas in a basic relationship, the band would be too narrow. An example of this band: the provider representative may not understand the consumer organization's procedures. For example, how does the consumer market their services to their clients? Or the provider may not understand who from the consumer side are involved in making decisions before they are communicated to the provider. And sometimes the consumer may not know how their request gets processed by the back-end provider teams. Therefore, this band could be different at different levels. There could be band of visibility between the provider and consumers technical departments, and a band of visibility between the consumer and providers management departments, and even senior management representatives. Let us practice a question based on our learnings on the customer journey from the Axelos sample paper for the exam. As mentioned before, the exam is based on multiple choice questions, and you have to pick up one correct answer. We'll look at question number 11 to start with regarding the customer journey. Sometimes you may have questions wherein two options may be correct, and you have to select a combination of two options as the correct answer. The question here is, which statement about the end-to-end customer journey is correct? It focuses on achieving outcomes. It represents a predetermined path. It reflects an overall perception, and it involves optimizing touch points. Option A, even though the journey does focus on achieving outcomes, the journey is not exactly this because it includes this interactions and touch points as well. Option B, it represents a predetermined path. Journey paths are not predetermined. During the journey, the customer may have a poorer experience and the path would deviate. C, it reflects an overall perception. Because the journey is a collection of touch points and service interactions, it creates an image or perceptions in the minds of the consumer, that is the customer or the user. Therefore, this is the best answer regarding the customer journey. It involves optimizing touch points. There are touch points, but there are also service interactions in the journey. Therefore, both the touch points and the interactions may need to be optimized if they are not working properly. Let us continue on the customer journey, but look at designing and improving customer journeys. There are stages for designing the end-to-end customer journey and experience, which consists of understanding stakeholders' aspirations, their personas, the various scenarios in the journey map creation, and the overall service blueprint. As part of the journey, we also need to relate to customer experience, design thinking, use of behavioral psychology, importance of culture, and the importance of measuring and improving customer journeys. There are 5 stages in designing the end-to-end customer journey and creating the positive experience for the customer. Beginning with understanding of the stakeholder aspirations, understanding and defining personas of consumers or customers, defining the various scenarios within the journey, and creating the overall journey map based on the combinations of the personas and scenarios, and eventually a complete service blueprint. We begin with the first stage, which is about understanding stakeholder expectations or aspirations. It is important to understand what stakeholders value by exploring their functional, social, and emotional dimensions by which they make their choices. Because choices are made based on their functional needs, their social needs, and emotional needs or dimensions. A good way to understand stakeholder aspirations is to apply the Disney Institute Compass model, where it considers four characteristics: needs, wants, stereotypes, and emotions. This model is a helpful tool for identifying needs, desires, and emotional mindsets of stakeholders using the four considerations. The needs are about the basic reasons to begin the journey and define stakeholder outcomes. The wants are less definitive. This is what people prefer to have. It improves their experience, their fulfillment help exceed expectations. Stereotypes, on the other hand, are perceived positive or negative notions about the experience. Therefore, history and culture need to be considered. And finally, emotions are the states which impact experience. Therefore, emotional intelligence and behavior analysis are necessary. An example of a need could be cost saving, by which the customer may want to migrate to a cloud environment. However, the wants could be: is the cloud highly customizable or future proof from a technology perspective? Stereotype could be: the customer might be thinking about security risk and they are not used to outsourcing because of the risk. And this could be a preconceived notion. And they may have other emotions regarding this need, want, and stereotyping. We move on to the next stage, which is understanding and defining personas. After having understood the stakeholder aspirations, a persona is a fictitious yet realistic description of a typical or target customer or user of a service or a product. Persona, therefore, is a singular user derived from a data range to highlight specific details and important features of a group of customers who exhibit similar attitudes or goals and behaviors in relation to a service and service provider. Therefore, a persona is not a detailed, broad category of consumers, but it is for a narrower category of consumers. Because using wide ranges will be difficult to summarize the attributes of a smaller group, and using wide ranges for a group category may make those statistics too impersonal and difficult to remember because of too many characteristics within a larger group. However, and also at the same time, it is impossible to map every individual customer journey. Therefore, generic flows may be required for a specific persona or a group of customers or a group of users. Remember that personas are not impersonal averages. They are actual representatives of single users or customers, but of a similar type. Personas are described as though we are real people. Let us look at an example persona. Miss Laila, who is a student, this is her overall characteristics. I need to be able to travel, relax, meet new friends, and get inspired without going bankrupt. A persona should capture a day in the life of this persona, their background, their online behavior, what they are looking for, their finances, what influences them, and their hopes and dreams. This is just an example. You may want to capture other things in a persona rather than always these only. Remember that personas are archetypes and these are not actual people, but they should still be described as real people. Therefore, there may be nobody named Miss Laila, but it represents a group of people who have these characteristics. This is based on user research to create a persona and therefore reflects shared characteristics of a small or a medium-sized customer group. One more important thing, that this persona should be related to the service used and not other things or biases. Sometimes note that consumers may not be human, but machines or other services in which feelings and motivations do not exist. But it is still possible to have a persona for a machine, for example, a persona for a robot. Next, we have the concept of scenarios. Scenarios are short stories about personas trying to achieve their goals by using the service or product in their context. Good scenarios answer the following questions. Who is the user? Why does the service consumer want the service? What goals does the service consumer have? How can the service consumer achieve its goals? Need to identify ideal experiences for scenarios that are most important. Combine these experiences to create a high-level customer journey map. While the persona captures characteristics based on stakeholders' aspirations, scenarios are connected to personas but in the form of stories, clarifying what experiences they are looking for, on what kind of journeys or scenarios they are looking for. For example, one scenario for Layla persona could be traveling on a weekend. Another scenario for the same persona Layla could be traveling once a year out of country. But this can be, the scenarios may be concluded only when the persona is clear from which the various scenarios could be identified. And these scenarios could form a customer's journey. The next, we come to the journey mapping. It is possible to have great individual touch points in a terrible journey, especially in multi-channel environments. We touched on this before when we have multi-channel environments wherein a user makes contacts to a service desk through a phone line and afterwards check status using email or maybe other channels. If the information is not integrated, then the user will experience frustration. Therefore, omni-channel arrangements are much better to improve the customer journey. And in this case, the individual touch points over the phone line and the email may be good, but the overall journey is frustrating for the user. Therefore, you must understand every touch point as a service provider, but also understand the entire end-to-end journey. A customer journey map visualizes the service consumer's experience. It communicates the journey and the customer's experience at every stage. It identifies key service interactions and for each of these, the motivations and questions. Customer journey maps typically include the following: the steps of the journey, the durations, the touch points, the service interactions, the personas, the service experience, and also who from the service provider and which roles interact with the consumer. One may also add to the journey map the following: the service consumer goals, provider goals, product and product features, the various communication channels, environmental properties, data sources, moments of truth, and prior improvements. We will be discussing moment of truth afterwards in another section in more detail. But remember, for now, moment of truth is a key interaction where an impression is formed by a user about the service quality of the provider. For example, in a certain phone conversation, an important one for the user, they may make an impression about the provider based on the provider's support provider. Remember the scenarios. Scenarios are customer situation specific and customer segment specific. In case of Laila persona, there were two segment examples. One was the traveling out of country and one traveling short travel during the weekend. It is possible to include both these segments in the customer journey, meaning both scenarios in that customer journey. This customer journey map shows the complete journey of the customer through the 7 steps of the journey. We can clearly see here the duration of each step of the journey and the various touch points which are happening between the customer and the provider. In fact, in this case, we look at the 3 consumer personas, the sponsor, customer, and the user in different colors of circles. And the touch points or interactions are happening over intranet, email, or meetings, and other channels. If you look at, for example, in the engage step, the meeting in which the customer is involved, their experience is neutral. They have involved with team 1 and team 3 of the service provider. On the other hand, we look at the signing of agreement by the sponsor during the agree step of the journey. They have engaged with team 2 and team 3 of the service provider, and their experience is a happy one. And here, if you look at this one, user access portal for the co-creation. And this is the user's experience, wherein they have interacted with team 1, team 3, as well as role 1 of the service provider, and their experience is quite poor. Customer experience. This is partly or completely shaped by factors outside the service provider's control, such as organizational branding and environment. Customer experience may be understood by feedback surveys. And the following may be understood through those surveys. What is the customer doing during each step? What encourages or discourages them from Moving to next step, what emotions does each step trigger? Are there questions the customer finds it hard to get answers to? In which context does the customer get anxious? Could uncertainties cause customer to give up and try another provider? What obstacles does the customer confront in each stage? And finally, what are the cost and risk factors? One way to enhance the customer experience is to use the Johari window, invented by Joseph and Harrington in the 1950s. It provides a four-quadrant model between two parties regarding four perspectives between them. The perspective of knowing oneself, known by self and unknown by self, as well as known by others and unknown by others. So when the provider has awareness of themselves, it's an open area. When the consumer also has awareness of the provider, it is an open area. Both parties know about the provider clearly. But sometimes the provider may not know something about themselves. In that case, if it is known to the consumer, then the consumer should provide feedback, or the provider should ask for feedback from the consumer, by which the provider will know about what was previously unknown to them about themselves. On the other hand, the provider may know some things about themselves, but those are unknown to the customer or the consumer. In that case, the provider may want to disclose that to the consumer. For example, they may want to disclose that there are other offerings and promotions going on. Or maybe some of the strengths which are unknown to the consumer may be disclosed. And lastly, there are areas about the provider which neither the provider nor the consumer may know. And these can be determined only by self-discovery or mutual shared discovery. In summary, the provider should seek feedback from the consumer on behavior in the invisible areas of the relationship, and the provider should make the consumer aware of the areas which only the provider knows about, but can benefit the consumer. We move on to a new topic, which is design thinking. Design thinking is a method that puts the user at the center of the design process. Design thinking is not new. It's been there for several decades, but has become more important in the recent years in many fields, including IT service management. Design thinking is actually about how designers should think to create innovative solutions which fit user needs. Meaning they need to engage with real users to correctly understand their problems and explore various ideas for resolution. We see here the 5 principles of design thinking proposed by Mark Stigdon. The 5 principles are to be user-centered, co-creative, sequencing, evidencing, and holistic. User-centered. Customers and users need to be at the center of the design process. Co-creative. All relevant stakeholders need to be included in the design process, particularly the user or the customer. Sequencing. Deconstructing the journeys into touch points and interactions, meaning the customer journey should be visualized as a sequence of interrelated actions, which mean the touch points and the service interactions. These actions could be human to machine, or even other third parties. For example, there may be an online feedback by a third party. Every such journey goes through a 3-step transition. There is a pre-service period, meaning getting in touch with the service, then the actual service period, experiencing the service, and then post-service period where the service is becoming end of life. Evidencing. Providing physical evidence or artifacts like souvenirs to trigger positive memories of service experiences, so that the customer will remember those positive experiences using the souvenirs or delights given by the provider at those times. For example, there could be a souvenir for every 100th customer who is making a purchase from an online site. But there may be more creative ways of giving souvenirs to all customers at some point in their journey. To be holistic, considering the environment as people can see, hear, smell, touch, taste, and emotionally feel the physical manifestations of services. Services are not an ordinary thing. They are felt emotionally also by the users and the customer. Let us now look at the 5 steps or stages of design thinking, the process that is. A typical customer journey design process may be as per the stages proposed by Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. The steps are empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. The empathize step is about learning about stakeholders and users, defining personas and scenarios, understanding them very closely, their needs and aspirations, and their ways of working. Defining is about defining the problem in human-centric ways, mapping existing customer journey, map stakeholder experiences, define outcomes, experiences, and value, set goals, and define metrics. Ideation, brainstorm and come up with many creative solutions. Once the empathy and definition has been completed. The next step is prototype, which is building a representation of one or more of the ideas. And the idea may be built and shown to others. And the last step is testing to get stakeholders to review, build in feedback loops, or interactive design. Customer journey design involves various fields of expertise: product design, graphic design, interaction design, social design, ethnography design. There are several tools available for this, like stakeholder maps, contextual interviews, the 5 whys, a day in the life of a persona, expectation maps, persona, storyboards, prototyping, A or B testing, storytelling, service blueprints, operating model canvas, etc. Behavioral psychology also plays a key role in the customer journey design. The concept of cognitive bias, which is a systematic pattern of deviation from rational thinking when making judgments. Sometimes people deviate from their normal reasonable thinking when making judgments, and these happen due to several reasons such as these. And these are known as cognitive bias. A peak end bias, wherein people disproportionately recall either high points or low points of their journey. For example, when they are extremely dissatisfied, they may remember that much more. Or when they are extremely delighted, they may remember that much more. Availability bias, based judgments on the things we remember. Well, even though I mentioned the remembrance in the peak end bias, but the peak end bias is more about the recalling of the high and low points. But the availability bias is based on any kind of memory, which connects strongly to the emotions. And loss aversion is another way to bias, wherein the pain of losing something is greater than the benefit of obtaining it, which means people want to be in control so that they don't lose something, but they may retain it for a longer period. Such biases, though they are deviations from rational thinking, they can be used in an advantageous manner for the benefit of the consumer. For example, the provider can work through the bad experiences much early so that the later part of the journey is much happier. Or pleasures can be broken down into several parts. Rather than giving pleasure in one moment, continuously split that into smaller pleasures. Or if there are several pains, why not combine the several pains into a single larger pain? Finishing on a strong positive note is also very useful because that will be remembered as a good ending by the consumer. And also giving consumers with various choices to give them a sense of control. For example, what to order, when to return, etc. Prevent surprises. Design the entire journey to incorporate these principles. Culture is another key aspect to be considered during the customer journey design. What is culture? It is a set of values that is shared by a group of people, including expectations about how people should behave, their ideas, beliefs, and practices. It is therefore part of the mental model. Mental model is an explanation of someone's understanding of how something works in the surrounding world. Culture differs for users from different countries, customers from different industries, users from different teams within the same organization, or users from different professions and sponsors from public organizations. The dimensions of culture is a good model to understand cultural differences. The 8 dimensions are communicating, evaluating, persuading, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, and scheduling. The two circles shown are people from two different cultures, and it shows us the difference in their 8 dimensions. Communication could be low context or high context. A low context means the communication has to be very explicit. There are no assumptions made during the communication. And high context means when many assumptions are made and the communication has many implicit assumptions rather than what is explicitly being stated. Evaluating could be based on providing direct negative feedback or indirect negative feedback. Persuasion may be done based on principles or applying the principles or giving a demonstration. Leadership could be based on equality or hierarchical command and control. Decision making could be consensus based or top down command and control approach. Trusting may be task based. Depending on the performance of the task, the trust may increase, or it could be relationship based purely. Well, all of them are not on either side, but it's a range in each dimension. Disagreements may be directly or confrontational or avoidance of the confrontation. And lastly, scheduling or timing may be inflexible or linear or flexible. The customer journey needs to be measured by taking feedback about the customer experience. The measurements should be done across the journey and at individual touch points and service interactions. There could be indirect measures such as quality of the product, practices being used, the value streams and resources. Begin at the top with a metric for customer experience and then go down, cascade down to key customer journeys and indirect indicators such as business indicators. Journeys need to be improved and there are many opportunities to improve, but the resources to make improvements may be less. Therefore, prioritization is important so that the gaps in the journey may be assessed and the improvement opportunities may be pursued based on their priorities. Quality remains the key focus area. Customer experience as well, wherein the best chances of high ROI is important to be considered. Return on investment, that is. Eliminating pain points is also important and look for areas which can distinguish the organization from its competitors. Problem management techniques may be used to isolate, determine the causes of issues and use them to identify the improvements at all levels. Let us now practice another sample question based on our learning. Question number 28. In the context of the 5 principles of service design thinking, which principle includes combining touch points and interactions into service moments? User-centered, co-creative, sequencing, and evidencing. User-centered is about putting customers and users at the center of the design process, meaning genuinely understand the needs of the users and customers. And the question is about combining touch points and interactions into service moment. Therefore, A is incorrect. B, co-creative. Co-creative principle is about involving stakeholders in the design process. All relevant stakeholders should be included in the design process. And therefore, the question is not connected to this. Sequencing is the next one. Sequencing is about deconstructing customer journeys into single touch points and service interactions. Then, when combining them, these create service moments. Therefore, the question is about combination of these touch points and interactions. Therefore, C is the correct answer. Evidencing is about using physical evidence or artifacts to trigger the memory of positive service moments, which uses emotional association so that customers can continue to enhance the customer's experience. The other principle which is missing here is the holistic principle. Let us look at 2 more questions before concluding this section. Number 1, a service provider would like to understand the complete end-to-end experience of a customer for a specific service. What should be done for this purpose? The question is about the complete end-to-end experience. A, identify either all service touch points or service interactions. B, map the customer journey. C, create customer personas. D, create scenarios. Option A is about identifying either all the touch points or service interactions, but that would not provide an understanding of the complete end-to-end experience. Therefore, A is incorrect. Mapping the customer journey, on the other hand, provides an understanding of the complete experience. Creation of personas and scenarios are only stages before creating the journey map. Number two, a service provider is planning to learn more about stakeholders by defining personas and scenarios. Which step in design thinking should be focused on? The question is about learning more about the stakeholders as part of design thinking. Is it ideation, prototyping, defining, empathizing? If you look at the sequence of these steps in design thinking, the first step is empathizing, then defining, then ideation, then prototyping, and finally testing. Empathizing is the one where it is about learning more about the users and working with them, observing their behaviors, and understanding more clearly. Therefore, the correct answer would be empathizing. And that brings us to the end of this section. Thank you.